Fantasy Zone is a game that has seen many ports on myriad consoles, computers, and more since its original release to arcades by Sega in 1986. What is even more interesting is how Fantasy Zone in general has appeared on several of Sega's rivals' machines. Some are definitely better than others, but one version in specific seems to have had the odds stacked heavily against it. Unlike, say, Fantasy Zone on PC Engine, which was licensed by Sega to NEC Avenue and officially released to NEC's home console, and even the Famicom version that was licensed and officially released by Sunsoft, Fantasy Zone on the NES is not only a Sega game on a Nintendo system at a time that they were perceived to be at war in North America, but also an unlicensed port at that. Developed by Pixel in 1989, it would become part of Tengen's brazen line of unlicensed games that included the now infamous, but superior, Tengen Tetris. Tengen Fantasy Zone takes a lot of heat even today, but does it really deserve its bad rap? Let's take a closer look. The idea behind Fantasy Zone is simple. Players take control of Opa Opa, a rotund sentient ship with little wings. Using 8-way control, players move around an indefinitely looping stage to search for and destroy several enemy bases. In other versions, such as arcade or on PC Engine, up to 10 bases need to be taken out. Some have fewer, but only 6 are required in the Tengen version. Players can see what bases are left on a small bar at the bottom of the screen. The area that the player is in is highlighted with a square, allowing players to get a better sense of where they are in relation to their next target. Even for its time in 1986, the way players traversed the playfield was a little uncommon. Fixed and force-scrolling shmups were the typical norm by then, so to have a shooter where players manually scrolled the stage based on their direction of travel was still pretty fresh. But players could also shoot in the direction they traveled as well, which is helpful thanks to the many enemies that would approach the player from both the left and right edges of the screen. Enemies that the player will encounter will appear in many formations. In previous versions, they would flash before shooting at the player, allowing for a bit of advance warning in crowded situations. However, they do not do this in the Tengen version, though less fire is generally shot at the player. When all of the bases in a stage have been taken care of, the player will then move on to a boss encounter where they are tasked with taking out a more challenging, large-scale enemy. Some of these bosses can be tricky, but never really feel impossible. This is doubly so in the Tengen version, as the bosses are often very easy by comparison to, say, the PC Engine version. While previous versions have players facing off against these bosses against an auto-scrolling backdrop, the Tengen version switches to a flat-colored screen for the encounter instead. Defeated enemies in Fantasy Zone will drop money for players to collect. Some enemies require full formations to be taken care of, while others reward players with coins for single-unit kills. Every now and again, a small shot balloon will appear, allowing players to spend their collected cash on various weapons and enhancements. Wings and engines to increase the player's speed, lasers and spread shots to enhance their fire, and bombs for increased attack coverage, not to mention screen-clearing bombers, can all be bought and equipped to Opa Opa. These are all typically applied differently. Speed and twin bombs are permanent. In the case of special weapon add-ons like the 5-way shot, laser, and wave weapons, they only last a certain amount of time. Stuff like the smart bomb and 10-ton weight are single use. But everything will be lost if the player dies. The shop is also where players will be able to buy additional lives, as the player's score does not grant extends. As is the case with all of the weapons in Fantasy Zone, the more players buy of any one type of item, the more it will cost the next time it's purchased, meaning that some strategy is needed to maximize offensive and defensive power while keeping enough cash in reserve for when it's needed, or for an additional life. Fantasy Zone plays over the course of 8 stages, which loop after the first set have been completed. Depending on how well players know the stages in general and the weapons obtained, the stages in this version can often be completed in a very short amount of time. The difficulty in the Tengen version is very tame, and a 1cc should be very easily obtained even by newer players. But is it any fun? Well, we've played a few versions of Fantasy Zone, and we enjoy the concept on the whole. The Switch M2 Sega Ages port and the PC Engine versions are definitely games that I'd revisit. But I'm not going to sit here and say that the Tengen version is anywhere near the best version of the game. Quite the opposite, actually. The layout is off, it's scaled way down, there's all kinds of jank when it comes to its control, and the enemies flicker and shudder all over the place, sometimes leading to an invisible, cheap death. But at a certain point, I still found myself having a blast with it. I felt comfortable zooming around with the jet add-on, laying waste to everything with twin bombs and the 5-way shot for a fast early stage clear. It feels very solid, despite not being very solid at all. Despite what most seem to say on the subject, this is nowhere near unplayable. Tengen Fantasy Zone is definitely a playable game, even if it's very shoddy under the hood. Our very fast 1cc proves this, but again, it's actually a very easy game as well. At the very least, players who have spent a lot of time with other versions might owe it to themselves to at least check out this one for a slightly different change of pace. Just, don't expect anything mind-blowing. The scoring in Tengen Fantasy Zone is incredibly basic. Every normal enemy and base in the game has a predetermined point value that is applied to the player's score when they're defeated. Even the bosses don't contribute to the score when they're taken out. For players looking to get the highest scores possible, grinding endlessly in each stage while keeping one base alive is the only real way to set a world-blazing score. Additional loops also help. Rather, it's actually the money that has the interesting mechanic here. In each stage starting out, players will receive the largest coins possible when taking out their foes, but as more coins are collected, they become less and less valuable until they reach a minimum worthless amount. This once again encourages a bit of strategy when it comes to collecting funds for enhancements and lives. In the end, we never really had an issue with collecting enough money to adequately outfit Opa Opa, though other versions' coins decrease in value much faster than they do here. Of course, bosses still release just a ton of money as they are blown asunder, so players can still get a ton of cash in any one stage regardless of how little they get in the stage proper. The presentation in Tengen Fantasy Zone definitely has its high and low points. So let's start with the visuals. Obviously, the NES does not have the color capability of the System 16 arcade board or the PC Engine, or even the Master System for that matter, so what's here is definitely going to lack in that respect. The backgrounds are also a little on the cheap side, yet retains the kind of imagery players should expect of a Fantasy Zone game in general. Opa Opa and the stages themselves might move relatively smoothly, but everything else just kinda jitters around with quite a bit of flicker thrown into the mix. It could be better. But then there's the sound. As far as Tengen Fantasy Zone's music is concerned, this could be one of our favorite versions to listen to. It definitely beats the Sunsoft version, which is kind of ironic because they'd become renowned for their audio chops on the Famicom and NES later down the line. The sound effects are less impressive, but aren't nearly as whiny as the PC Engine version. The rest of the game is kind of average, we suppose, but some aspects are still lacking. No stage auto-scrolling for bosses, no fancy stage name titles at stage start, and a general lack of options make Tengen Fantasy Zone a game with only little staying power, despite how much has grown on me. But when it's all said and done though, how does Tengen Fantasy Zone stack up? Let's take a look. The controls in Tengen Fantasy Zone are jank, but not game-breaking. Tengen Fantasy Zone is also perhaps the easiest one out of all of the other versions so far. Tengen Fantasy Zone's 8 stages fly by with only 6 bases per stage and super easy boss fights. The visuals in Tengen Fantasy Zone are definitely off-brand. Perhaps the strongest part of this package, its soundtrack is actually pretty excellent. While Fantasy Zone in general would go on to inspire such excellent games as Blackbird, as far as ingenuity is concerned, there are better earlier versions of this game from a technical standpoint on other systems, including the Famicom. These carts can get pretty pricey as they are a little on the uncommon side. We'd only recommend going after this one as a Fantasy Zone version completionist. Tengen Fantasy Zone absolutely has its problems, but there's still kind of an enjoyable game here if players can look past its many flaws. Better versions definitely exist though, and as much as I liked it, Tengen Fantasy Zone gets a 2.75 out of 5. Because of its technical faults. Copies of Tengen Fantasy Zone should be able to be found at auction fairly easily, and even in the wild though less commonly so. This was a bit of a surprise episode as this exact 1cc was just casually filmed with no real expectation of it happening. Speaking of easy 1cc's, Airgrave is coming in hot on the PSX. Will it be as easy as Santos' other title, Stahlfeder? We'll see in episode 274.